You see this guy up there? I like for us to think about the parables that Jesus taught. They are loaded with truth, loaded with his teaching. So we're going to talk about one of them today. Did you know that according to the Reuters news service, the man was alone and he was on a winding two-lane road in western North Carolina in the mountains. Visibility was poor, and the road was covered with ice and snow. And as he's driving along, the driver skidded sideways, out of control on a sharp curve. He careened off of the rocky hillside, and after careening back and forth, he plunged down a 300 feet drop-off. And just as the car went over, he was ejected out just a few feet below the roadbed there, and he struggled by himself up to the road itself, found a huge, great big rock there, leaned against it, hoping someone would come along and give him some help. Shortly after, a minister came along. He was late already for a speaking engagement at a Valentine's Day banquet. And it was at a church nearby, and he thought if he just kept going, he'd make it all right. He slowed down, and he could see that the injured driver was standing upright. And so he looked at his watch and just kept driving on. Shortly after that, a businessman was returning from a meeting with some of his elders in his church. His office had closed, and after the closing time, he was meeting with these other elders, and they were making plans for the summer camp program. And so he was a little bit late, and he hadn't really counted on the snow being as heavy as it was. And just before he came on this scene of the accident, his wife called him on his cell phone, and she was upset. The dinner was getting cold. And so he looked at the man. The man was wearing a coat, so he was nice and warm. He had boots on, and he had a hat on. So he figured he'd be all right till somebody else came along, and so he kept on driving too. A little over 10 minutes passed, and suddenly it seemed like hours to the injured man, but suddenly a biker on one of those big, huge Harleys, he got lost on his way to Knoxville. And so he happened to be up on that road and showed up there. And there he is, he's straddling his bike, holding on there. He's wearing a heavy fleece-lined jacket with the sleeves cut off, and his arms are filled with tattoos. He's wearing a helmet that's got all kinds of threatening type things on it there. He's not what you would think of as a rescuer, but he pulls alongside of the man, shuts his bike off, and says, "Hey, dude, you look like you've been chewed up and spit out. I was a corpsman in Nam. Let me have a look at you." So he got off of his bike, took a first aid kit out of his saddlebag, and he treated the driver's wounds. And after he treated him, he had him hop on back behind him and hold on tight. And following that injured driver's directions, he took him to the closest hospital, made sure that he got treated there. And after he got treated, then the biker found out from one of the hospital workers that he was really close to Knoxville. So he just went on, left. Isn't that a neat story from Reuters? But I got to tell you something. It's not the truth. I just made it up. I did. Sounded right, didn't it? I just made it up. But I'm not the only one that makes up stories to make a point. So did Jesus. We call them parables. I guess he did too, because the disciples asked, why do you teach in parables? But he did this one that I'm going to read to you because he was answering a man's question. So if you're looking in scriptures, turn over to Luke chapter 10 with me, and I'm going to start down at verse 25. On one occasion, an expert of the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? Jesus replied. How do you read it? And he answered, love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, you have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. But he, the man who was a student of the law, wanted to justify himself. And so he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes. They beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. Soon, too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came to where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. And he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins, and he gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expenses that you might have. Then Jesus said, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert of the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus said, go thou and do likewise. You understand, don't you, that the lawyer was asking the question because he wanted to justify himself. Wanted to make sure that Jesus knew how much he knew about the law, and so he was good. And so he asked this question. Have you ever done that? Try to justify yourself with Jesus? Think about the times you might have done that and what kind of an excuse or story you might have made up. So when he asks this, Jesus understands this is a good question, and he can answer and teach this man and to teach us also. Maybe it's a question that you and I have asked many times in our life. Who is my neighbor? Maybe we didn't ask that question in exactly those words, but some words similar to it. maybe couched in a different phrase, like we might have said to God or to ourselves, how close do these people have to live to me to be a neighbor? Or how far away do they have to live? Or maybe we said, so who am I comfortable with? Would that be my neighbor? Who should I give my time to? Who should I be praying for? Who's vulnerable? Who needs my help after all? Who should I spend money on? Or we might have asked it this way: who don't I have to love? That may be a little bit easier. Who counts? Who am I responsible for? Now here's the thing, folks. I think we need to remember that we live in a world full of need. It is everywhere. I don't think we go through a single day without being aware of people far away or close by that have some needs in very special ways. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I don't suppose you have the same issues that I have, but I get stuff in the mail. Do you? That talks about people's needs. For this sermon, I wrote a list down. I don't think this is all of them, but I wrote a list down of who we get mail from asking for help. There's St. Jude's Hospital. There's the Wounded Warriors. There's the Disabled Veterans of America. There's Boys Town, the Shriners Hospital, the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the March of Dimes, hospice. We have 4 hospices in Burlington. I get those. The Diabetes Association, Easter Seals, the Sheriff's Association. I get one from the Guilford County Sheriff's Association, and I get one from the National Sheriff's Association. Those guys want me to be in good company. I even got a little thing I can carry around that shows that I sent them some money there. There's the Volunteer Firefighters Association, the American Cancer Research, St. Joseph's Indian School, and I don't even know where that is. There's the American Lung Association, and then there's just a whole bunch more. What I'm trying to point out to you is there's a lot of people in need that we have some kind of contact with every day of our life. So I guess this is my definition of a neighbor. A neighbor is anyone in need that we are in a position to help. Let me say that again. A neighbor is anyone in need that we are in a position to help. Did you notice when I read this story that Jesus made up, that he never does answer this guy's question? The guy says, who's my neighbor? And what does Jesus do? He tells a story. Now, you and I wouldn't particularly like that, because if we ask a question, we want a direct answer, right? And I don't know what this lawyer guy, what he did, but he got some very powerful truths, because what Jesus did is he describes for him what a neighbor is like. Not who's your neighbor, who's my neighbor, but what is a neighbor like? How do you act towards somebody there? Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus made this story up of 3 travelers. And we listen to it, and sometimes we just kind of pass it off to the side. But this has barbs in it. And so we need to think about it. Is anybody here desire to have a bad neighbor? Raise your hand if you want to have a bad neighbor. You don't want to have one? Well, guess what? Your neighbors don't want to have one either. And that's you and me. So let's see if we can't figure out what Jesus is saying here. I broke this down into 6 different words. of how Jesus is describing to not only this lawyer, but to us, what a neighbor's like. And in doing so, I'm asking you, as I ask myself, to ask yourself, am I a neighbor? And who is my neighbor around me? One of the things you notice as Jesus teaches this, 2 words, it heightens perspective. In other words, you begin to look at things a little bit differently. This man's sight was intensified by the love that he had for God's creatures there. The victim in this story, in case you really didn't know this, he had traveled alone on a narrow, desolate, twisting, turning path that was 17 miles long. And it dropped in that 17 miles 3,300 feet from where he was traveling down to where the journey ended there. Cliffs and caves on either side of this trail or road or path, whatever you want to call it, made it very, very good hiding place for thugs and for robbers and even for murderers. The road went from Jerusalem to Jericho, and in fact, there's a good chance that Jesus, when he stopped to tell this story, when this man approached him, was traveling on this road himself, because he was on his way to Bethany, to Mary and Martha's. And that's where this road went. So he might have been on there at the time, and the road was called by the local people around there at that time the Bloody Way. That's how bad it was. And in this story, Jesus told, this man's traveling down that way. When Jesus told this story, it's kind of like telling a scary story in a scary place. This is a dangerous place to be. And these people, as they listened to his words, could visualize this picture because it was not an uncommon thing. But I want you to notice in this story the verbs that he uses. Let me point them out to you. The priest saw the man. The Levite looked on the man. And both of them passed by the man. The priests and the Levites just did not perceive the man in the ditch as a neighbor. What they perceived him as was a burden, something to delay them from accomplishing whatever it was they were going to do that put them on the road there in the first place. But the big question, I think, for us this morning is not why didn't these guys stop and help the guy, but why don't we? What are the reasons that we didn't help somebody that we could have helped there? The writer of Proverbs says in chapter 14, whoever is kind to the needy honors God. So hopefully we are trying to honor God in our lives, and by the way we would help someone. The Samaritan not only saw the man and the need, but he had the courage to care and to act upon it. His whole perception was changed. The other 2 words are deepens compassion. As he looked and saw, he took pity on the man. That's what Jesus says in his story. He took pity on him. The compassion of the Samaritan is not seen in the fact that he recognized the wounded man's misfortune. Those other 2 guys did too. They saw that. What's significant is that when he saw it, he not only stopped, but he stopped to help, to see what he could do. Isaiah, in his prophecy in the 58th chapter, says, if you spend yourself on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will shine in the darkness. Isn't that what Jesus told us to do? Let your light shine. So here we are. The compassion of that alienated man moved not down the street, but he moved across the road instead. He had no reason to. This guy had no motive to do that. He had no excuse for doing it. But the point was simple in Jesus' story. A priest you would expect. He represents God to the people. And he represents the people to God at the same time. You would expect him to love God enough to do what God said and to love people enough to help them when they were in need. To love your neighbor as yourself. But obviously in this story, neither the priest nor the Levite loved God enough to care for this wounded man. John says in his first epistle, if anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? I seriously doubt, folks, that this Samaritan guy's daytimer read today, help a bloody guy on the roadside. I don't think that's probably written in his schedule. And yet he interrupted his entire agenda, whatever it might have been. He sacrificed big bucks and many hours of time to help this wounded man out. And he did this to a total stranger. And I might add on this that not only was the man a total stranger, but if the thing was turned around and the Samaritan was the wounded one and the other guy was passing by, more than likely he would not have stopped. Do you remember there's quite a bit of animosity between the Samaritans and the Jews? In most cases, the Jews would go out of their way to avoid being around a Samaritan there. In fact, the animosity was so strong back then that around 6 A.D., the Samaritan people snuck into the temple in Jerusalem during the Passover time, which is their high season there. And they sprinkled the blood of dead animals all through the temple there, just to make it unclean, just to be, mean, ornery? That's how much animosity there was there. And yet, he is stopping to help this man who is in great need there. I got to tell you, there's lots of roads today that we need to cross instead of just going down on and keep going there. 2 other words. Broadens actions. Do you see what Jesus is talking about here? The perception's changed. The compassion is deepened. And actions are broadened. What the priest and the Levite did says a great deal about what they perceived. They saw danger. They saw inconvenience. They saw financial cost. They saw an inability to be compensated. And they also saw something that was a common scene in their day. In those days, the priests and other workers in the temple in Jerusalem worked on a shift. I mean, you might work for a month at a time. It might be 2 weeks at a time. But the rest of the time, you're not there. So most of them did not live in Jerusalem. In fact, a good number of them lived in Jericho. Jericho had become what was called a priestly city because so many lived there and then went to Jerusalem to serve their, quote, term of office, if nothing else there. And these two guys could have either been coming or going in that particular scene there. They were respected leaders, the priests and the Levites. They were probably known for their wisdom and for their righteousness. So maybe in their mind, as they passed this man, maybe they had religious duties to do, and maybe they believed that if they had even touched that man, he might have been a corpse, he might have been dead, and they would have been unclean. They would have been excluded from their temple duties that they were supposed to be doing. And maybe they just didn't think that they could be any help at all. You know, they wouldn't know how to help somebody in that condition. Or maybe even they thought this could be a trap. Wouldn't have been the first time if that was the case. People had been lured to the side of the road, kind of like what you and I are today. We see somebody's car broken down. Do you stop? Or do you think, could be a trap? That's what they were thinking back then, lots of times there. Proverbs says in the 21st chapter, if a man shuts his ears to the cry of the poor, he too will cry out and not be answered. This Samaritan saw the same things that those guys saw, but he stopped, he stooped, he fixed him up, he took him to the hospital or to the inn, and he sacrificed to help him. He was a neighbor. 6 words that sum up not just what happened, but summed up and describes for us what being a neighbor is like. Our perception is heightened. Our compassion is deepened. Our actions are broadened. Now, this is pretty much a review for most of us here this morning. We've probably heard this story so many times, from the time maybe we were little in Sunday school up until where we are right now. So it seems like it's just repeating the same thing over and over again. But let's bring it down to right here and now in your life and in mine. What kind of a neighbor are you? I don't necessarily mean to the guy next door, but to the people around us, those who are in need. What kind of a neighbor are you? Jesus said, if you give so much as a cup of water in my name, you will not lose your reward. Some of us, it's just as hard to give a cup of cold water or something similar, some simple thing, as it is to give some big thing. We just begin to excuse ourselves. Have you dried anybody's tears lately? Have you lifted somebody's burden? Can you recall the last time you helped the underprivileged? How long has it been since you made a stranger feel welcome in our church or at home or anyplace else? How long has it been since you crossed a racial line in friendship? Up to this very moment, in what way have you given relief to the devastated?